All right, so we have our panel of experts all ready to go. We missing somebody? Scott, okay. All right, well, we'll just add him when he gets here. All right, who has a question for all these brainy types up here? Ah, lovely, go.
So my question is, what makes a good Scrum Master? So I don't mean like you have to have good social skills and collaborative skills like we learned today, that's obvious. But a couple of assumptions. One, they've come from somewhere else, so they've had experience in maybe development or testing or project management or something. So which of those is, in your experience, the people that have the best chance of success as a Scrum Master? The other assumption I'm making is that it's a part-time role. So one of the patterns I've seen is that some teams don't want their tech lead to be the Scrum Master because that's a critical role, so they get the QA lead to be the Scrum Master because it's deemed to be more of an administrative overhead role. So what are the best design patterns for a Scrum Master?
All yours, Linda.
Okay. Can I start by saying what you don't want? Would that be okay? So what you don't want is somebody who thinks, and you alluded to this a little bit by saying it is, after all, an administrative role. So if somebody thinks it's a managerial role and treats it that way, and runs the stand-ups, for instance, as though it were a status meeting, and you can feel that when you walk into the room, that people are expecting to line up and report, and they're really missing the point of the stand-up, which is to promise to each other, to build collaboration, to build trust, and a whole host of other things that are involved in the daily stand-up. So you don't want somebody who has that viewpoint for the role. It's not. So I won't hog the stage. All these people have good ideas.
We have this conversation a lot. What makes a good Scrum Master? We don't, in beginning Agiles, Agile adoption, we don't let them write code, period. But they are part of the team, so we have these slogans we put on t-shirts. I don't write code, but I deliver, and on the back it says I'm a Scrum Master. So they begin to think, but I have a list of 43 different things a Scrum Master has to do. And anybody that takes a look at that and thinks that's a part-time job, they're absolutely crazy. The keys for me is a good Scrum Master is a facilitator, has the courage to hold the mirror in front of the teams and say, are we really done? Are we really doing what's on the backlog? Are we really operating in priorities? And the one that helps the team succeed, and above all, does not take ownership away from the team in any way, shape, or form. I have a really hard time when people say our project managers are becoming Scrum Masters, because then they have this tendency to tell people what to do. And that's totally wrong, because now they've taken ownership away from the team.
So I have a good friend who was the software manager of a team, and they were doing Scrum and became the Scrum Master and stuff. I mean, he still had the software manager role, but he took that role of blocker and enabler for the team. And that was actually very empowering for him to do that. So sometimes people say, well, what do you do with managers now that you know, whatever. So he was actually a very facilitated manager, blocking with, requests that were coming in and disruptions to the team. But one of the things he did was he was always a player coach, which is kind of a rare, just to counteract with it. He would take one of the non-critical pieces of the code and actually pair with someone to do it, so he could appreciate the difficulties that his team was really feeling viscerally, so he could go and be a better blocker. And that was, he wrote an experience report about this, several years ago that was presented at the Agile conference. And he's now a mid-level manager at a different company, but that sort of developing an empathy and enabling for the team. And for his one of the things that he had to do did have to keep at least technically aware and feel their pain. So somebody that has no empathy or appreciation for what they're really going through and the challenges may not be as good as an enabler because they don't get it. So that's just a story that I'd like to share. He did a good job.
I believe they can write code after a while, but I don't like him to do it at the beginning.
Oh yeah, that was not his role at all.
Yeah. No, I like them to be full-time Scrum Masters until they master in the Shura read process. They're somewhere in the middle. They have enough experience to know that when they can do it and when they can't.
So so I have a dysfunctional Scrum Master. I know what you're saying, what not to do is that someone who is the process police type person as opposed to the project manager is also not necessarily a good one. If the team wants to adapt the process, again, it's a facilitated type of role. Team, but someone who is, no, we're doing this wrong, is the wrong way of doing it, but here's what, they're asking questions if they're observing things, rather than this sort of, nope, doing it wrong. That's not very good. So actually, someone new to that role needs to, the facilitated side is really very important and enabling.
Is that answering your question?
Yep.
Is there anything else that?
Well, what about pros and cons of a person with a testing background versus a development background?
I
Do you
think
think it matters?
both can do that job, in my opinion.
Yep, doesn't matter.
Anybody else?
I work in a team that has a bunch of people that are coders, a bunch of people that are testers. Everyone winds up doing a certain amount of testing. Is there a rule of thumb that people have in terms of who should or should not validate certain parts of the system in terms of going through a story? Should the person that develops it, that actually code the story, never touch the validation portion of that?
So I think there was this myth, and I started out life as a tester, so I have very strong opinions about this. There was this myth that says that we shouldn't know how something works in order to test it. And so you can only be unbiased in order to be a good tester. So, and that developers really don't want to do this anyway. So there's all these things kind of going around. And what I've seen and I've been really excited by is teams that are blending roles to become more efficient, where they may have skills and expertise, but they're actually working together. So again, I go back to experience reports, but there was an experience report this year at Agile conference where a woman was embedded as a QA lead into a dev team. And so she pairs with developers, helping them write tests of various kinds, as well as helping them write better unit tests. And so I've also known another team where people take on the role of, they're a specialty, they may be a back-end or a front-end kind of developer, but they also do testing. All of the developers for this team do testing of various different kinds after it is tested. They do exploratory testing. So I think that there's this, and they did this to be more efficient and to be more effective and have less bugs, and they were both successful. Now, these are two cases of where it really works. A rule of thumb is that people do have expertise that you want to exploit, but spreading knowledge can be nothing but good for the team. Testing is not a second-class activity.
Anybody else got anything to add to
I
that?
was going to say, the only thing I would add to that is the idea is that there should be more than one pair of eyes on the code. And so as long as the same person is not writing and in isolation, that is not pairing, and then claiming to have done all the testing of any kind, other than that, involve as many other people as possible. That's always a good idea. The more pairs of eyeballs, fewer incidences you're going to have. I don't know if there's any, you have to follow some algorithm or rule about who does what.
I guess maybe a follow-up question is along the lines of, is it problematic to have the same person that does the coding babysit or do the testing? Like, is there a psychological issue in terms of that, of run until it's successful or versus run until it fails?
Yes,
Do we need to repeat the question?
If you have some wrong understanding of the requirement, you're going to write the code wrong and the test wrong, and you're going to pass the test.
Sure.
So
Bias.
that's pretty well known. That doesn't exclude people to write code and the test, but as Linda just said, we probably want to add other people to both at the test and at the code, because we have, people develop immediately because of cognitive biases. So again, people develop some idea of something and they hook into it, and they're going to have the same idea when they write the corresponding test.
One of the things that we've seen is, when the developer drags the card to ready for test in our world, there's an expectation that you've done a bunch of this testing that you should do as a developer, and then we use GitHub pull requests where there's another round of a developer that's actually looking at that code. Oftentimes they pull up that branch and they execute it and see what's going on. Does this really make sense? And then it goes to QA, and our QA guy will sometimes pair people in to help them test, because it's that I don't exactly know all of the details behind this, but if we work together, I have a different perspective than you do. That I think it's really the mindset that a tester thinks differently than a developer.
Working with one client right now who the business put up the money to have 7 Scrum teams just build automated tests. They paid for it. So there you go. They're not writing code. They're just writing the test for the whole testing of the whole suite in parallel with another 18 Scrum teams that are writing the code. So it's pretty, well, not probably 18, probably 15 or something. So it's pretty impressive that the company would understand that. The one thing that always surprised me is, and then you can't make this stuff up. So this guy said, I said, you have to get to done in your own Scrum team. And he said, well, I don't have a QA person on my team. I said, what? It's like, huh? There are no QA drops. It's the first thing I thought. There are no QA drops. You get to done. If you need a QA person to help you, they're roaming around probably somewhere. You get to done in your own sprint.
Any final comments on that? Okay, is everybody able to hear the questions? Are you okay? Sound-wise? Okay, next question. Yes, sir.
So,
You might want to speak up a little bit, though.
yeah, the situation where the Agile teams have published their capacity for the release, let's say some kind of a story point, they can take a certain number of story points and release. And based on that, they make commitment to the product owner saying that these are the features we can deliver in a release. Let's take an example, 3 sprints in a full block point release. So they make commitments based on that. And then as we progress, the taken items from the backlog and progress working with the backlog, some point we realize that we're not able to complete all the items that we're committed. But what happened behind the scene, the product owner goes back to hundreds of customers and commits that this release is coming after 3 months and these are the features coming in. And after 2 sprints, we realized that we can deliver only 80% of the features, and 3 sprints, and here is the remaining 20% of the features, which were originally thought that can be done, but due to complexity, as we were never done a very detailed kind of analysis when we committed, because it's all based on the preliminary estimates or wrong exercise or something like that.
Well, you
So
ought to
how
fire
I
this
thought-
product owner immediately. That's the first step, because they don't commit for the team to the customer. That's absolutely ridiculous, one. Number two, IBM does this twice a year. They release everything, all their products, on the same day in all 7 lines of work. The way they do it is they use the 60-40 rule. The Scrum teams only commit to what they can get done in 4 months. That's what,
Even though they have 6 months to work.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what happens if they're not able to deliver what is committed? In
they
time?
figure they can make it in 4 months, anything that blows up. In their experience, what blows up gets fixed in the 2 months, but there's nothing added. They make the decision at the very beginning and nobody messes with it. Nobody changes it. That's what they still have a backlog. If they get done after 4 months or 5 months with everything they committed to, then they actually can pick something off the backlog and start it. What I have learned over my many, many years of disappointing sales and marketing people is they are unhappy when they sell it. They are unhappy till they sell it to the customer and they can't deliver it. But they are never unhappy when you deliver them something extra that they get to sell. So why are we killing ourselves here? You commit to 60% of the time only. And when I ever work with a team now, right with the product owner and the product manager, I stand up there and this is the decision filter, and every time they start committing, I say, can you get it done in 4 months? And don't overload yourself. Don't slit your wrist, no matter how much the product owner, the product manager, or the business leans on you. I have spent hours and hours and hours convincing them that they can live with the 60-40 rule. Don't slit your own wrists. And tell them, yeah, we can do that. Don't do it. It takes discipline in this business. And so one thing I learned about Agile, if your product owners don't follow the discipline, your teams don't follow the discipline, you're going to end up failing. And the discipline is, I own the solution, I commit. You own the what and the why, you don't commit. Those are the rules. I got on a roll there. Sorry.
There's a slight alternative. She kills the product owner. Maybe you want to educate the product owner.
As long as he's not the product owner.
And surely you knew early that there might be a chance that things would go wrong? I mean, how soon were you aware of that problem? I mean, did this just suddenly happen?
No, it could be situations where the complexity increases when you come to the real implementation. Then you realize that it's going out of hand. So sometimes you think that it can get completed within this sprint, but it goes beyond.
Guess what? Sometimes we don't deliver everything we promise, even if we do 60-40. I mean, life happens. So one of the things that I find interesting is to have a discussion, and I think the role between product owner, program manager, and someone who knows about the technical risks that exist, or QA, can have an honest discussion about risks and look about backlog and priority in order to, here's the risks I see. Are we going to do anything about them, or are you going to put blinders on or not? So sometimes even the ordering of tasks so that you can do hard things first so that you can prove things out. I mean, there are known ways of working to reduce risk. We can mitigate risk, we can insure against risk, or we can be like ostriches and put our heads in the sand. So if there are perceived risks, certainly having a conversation about them and honestly dealing with them in a project is great. And now that's really hard if you have a new team, new technology, new process, new teammates working together, and we're committing. That's kind of that's really that's bad. But if otherwise, you can do things.
Also, this explosion in complexity doesn't show up 2 days before the release. As soon as you have some early sign of it, rather than putting your head in the sand or hoping that things are going to fix themselves, that's the time at which you re-initiate a discussion about what you can deliver. And this may be 2 weeks into that release, rather than 5 months and 3 weeks.
Often these teams that the team gets a hint early on. Believe me, right? Never had a team that doesn't start walking down this pathway that says, "Oh wait, this could be a big one." Do your planning poker, and you're going to end up with a whole bunch of question marks. There's a problem. We sometimes form what we call a discovery team, made of the product owner, the architect, maybe a UX developer, and a couple of key players from the team. They work a little bit ahead. So they will discover this complexity and try and work on maybe some prototypes or risk mitigation, some of those things. They work about 2 sprints ahead sometimes. They will form that. When it's not useful anymore, they'll disband it. They'll go on and they'll say, "Oh, we need one again," bring it back. It's adaptive. They adapt. Get the people they need. Make sense?
Final comment?
What was the question?
But it's about transparency. It sounds like lots of people were not talking to other people, and things were hidden from various other people, and then the team itself was hiding their concerns until maybe it was too late, and that's not what it's all about. I don't care how many daily stand-ups you're doing.
Just have a question. So in the Agile framework, there isn't really a role for project manager. So as companies adopt Agile, Scrum, is there still need for project managers, PMOs, or should we just train them to become Scrum Masters? Or, well, I guess, what did you see in the real world in different companies? What happened there? What did they do?
You want to dive in on that one?
Me, I get this one. Project managers, it depends on their mentality, their attitude, and their style. Okay. If their command and control is, "I'm going to tell you what to do and how to do it," don't ever make them Scrum Masters. They're never going to get there. 30% of the people that are sitting in that space will never change. I mean, we've had to let people go because they couldn't make an adapt to a more collaborative model where I'll help you discover the answer, but I'm not going to give it to you. Product managers, it's a very difficult problem in the Agile space because project leaders or project managers come up through the organization solving problems. Then they get into a leadership role and they have to stop solving the problems and they have to help other people solve them without giving them the answer. Because as soon as they give them the answer, they have ownership. Then the team doesn't have ownership and they give up. Productivity goes to 50% or less and you wonder why Agile's failing. There you go. What do you do with them? That depends on the person. Are they collaborative? Can they step back? Can they help people discover the answers and not tell them the answers? Some of you guys in the class yesterday know how hard that is. It's not easy. But you can learn it. But some people aren't going to get it. And I have seen so many Agile adoptions fail because of command and control leaders. I mean, flat out, won't work. So if they're command and control, see if they want to change, and if they don't, boot them out. Otherwise, they have to become facilitators. I don't know, I know that's blunt. Nothing new for me, is it? It's not pleasant. Everybody asks me this question. Going from a manager to a leader is very difficult. We need leaders in Agile, not managers.
Oh, right.
There he goes. So I finally said it. We got him talking down there.
Okay.
There's a great video that comes out of the Lean Enterprise Institute. It's a DVD with some Q&A, I believe, with John Shook, who is a leader of Lean Enterprise Institute, former Toyota exec and a Toyota scholar, who has this very fascinating monologues, who says that we've got so much leadership because we've got too little management. And what he's saying is management is ineffective, and therefore we have to have heroic white knights riding in to answer all the questions, clear out all the strife, and move on. And the reason that that's true is because the managers aren't effective. It might just be quibbling about terminology, and my methodological cultural background leads to different interpretations of these words for me, but I'm not a fan of this idea of putting it all on leaders and leadership and servant leadership and these things, because, you know, basically that takes our eyes off the prize that we don't. We need to be developing good management and good managers, whether that's command and control or otherwise.
I guess my definition of a manager is one who takes care of tasks and makes sure they all get done. My idea of a leader is one who holds the vision, the purpose, and the direction in front of everyone without telling them how to do it. That's it. So someone that sweeps in and tells people the answers and tells them how to solve the problem immediately takes ownership away from the team, is considered a hero, and our organizations reward them. So all these people that worked on it didn't have a chance to fail, which you learn more from your failures than you do from your successes, and they didn't have a chance to succeed. So you robbed them of all of this, of all their work, either knowing it works or it doesn't work, and in learning or not learning. And you're a jerk. I'm blunt about it. You know, I don't want to work for those people, and I don't know anybody that does. I want a leader that inspires me and helps me think and look at my problems differently so I can break through what's blocking me and find a solution that I can believe in and I can pursue. That's it. I think you agree with that. It's just terminology.
Yeah, we're talking the same language.
Yeah, that's right.
I wanted to take a shot at your question and come at it from a different angle, because, you know, I think of why is there a project manager in the organization? Because there was a requisition, there was a requirement, you know, there was an empty box that we had to put a check mark in the shape of a project manager. And now we're doing the same thing with Scrum Masters. It's ironic, like, what's behind this question? Do we take project managers and make them Scrum Masters? And the reason we're asking that question is that we've presumed a solution before we know what the problem is. And maybe the right thing to do is step back and say, what problems are we facing? And which people in which roles need to be there, rather than trying to figure out where to rejigger people as we you know, refactor the organization, so to speak.
Do you have any success of failure stories from actual companies that you see or you work with? They might come from a conventional kind of project manager or waterfall, from project managers, transform to Agile, try to convert to Agile. How did they succeed? How did they fail?
Well, we've had 15 years of Agile, so there's no way in hell that we haven't had successful transitions from any role to its corollary, Agile. Right? So there's no, absolutely. Do I know them? I
There's a
don't
whole bunch of
remember working with project managers. It's been a long time, and that's not to say because Agile is so grand and it's displaced project managers. It's just the way my path has gone. I've not been working with project managers at all. Ironically, I'm talking with a design research firm, about joining their company as with the title project manager. but it's not. The problem is these are titles, and these are like formulas of people that aren't really in consideration of what the problems you're facing. And if you don't like take staffing or even the names of roles on your team and figure them out based on what kind of problem you're trying to solve, then you're really, it's a cookie cutter. Like that's the thing, that's the style of thinking that Agile came along to challenge in the year 2000. It was this non-thinking way of approaching things. And you know, here we are back at it. All that's happened is we've had Agile, it's moved a little bit further away from that non-thinking, and the non-thinking stuff is caught up with it and is starting to inhabit Agile. So I always like this question. What problem does that solve? Or what problem are we solving? That seems to kind of, well, sometimes it actually just pisses people off. But it can have the effect of, refocusing on what we're trying to do rather than who we're trying to restaff.
Yeah, at Orbitz, when we made the transition to Agile, actually one of the problems was that from the development team, there was thoughts on some project manager, or no project manager could become a Scrum Master. And it was almost a reverse discrimination. It said one or two came out to be stellar, or really, really good, but it was really, they were the right person in the right role. And there was a lot of, all the teams had to ask, what is the role here and what do we need? So the talk about fitting the people in is far more important than figuring out that we have these open, or we've got these requisitions, and now we have to figure out what we're going to slot them. That's, you're doing yourself to failure. Figure out why you need it in the first place.
Figure out whether you need a Scrum Master first before you figure out who's going to be the Scrum Master.
Yeah.
Because there shouldn't be an assumption that you have a Scrum Master.
I had,
Ultimately,
oh no, go ahead.
ultimately, regardless of what practices you put in place, in a large organization that has many projects, you need to identify the one person from whom other part of the company are going to ask 3 questions. When will we be done? How much is it going to cost us to get there? And will they like it? After that, if you have identified that person, whether this takes 5 minutes of his day or the whole day or the whole week, what practices you put in place are a matter of context. In some cases, you may need Scrum Masters and do Scrums. In some cases, you don't need to have Scrum Masters and do Scrums. But the 3 fundamental questions, when will we be done, or will we be done by the date we said, to echo your question, and how much will it cost us, basically which resources do we need to get there, and will they like it, which is related to a large extent to quality. You need to identify someone to ask this question, and once you have identified that person will distribute the work, organize the work, delegate the work the way it's suitable. And we can leave the project manager at that. Not, did I pass the exam of the PMP and I know everything about earned value system? I don't think it's nice to know, but that's not the definition of what the project manager is.
Any additional comments from anyone else? Do we have another question from the floor? All right, you're gonna have to meet me.
I can probably holler.
All right. Everybody hear him?
Yep. My question is around, I think, Pollyanna, you mentioned that there's a project where the business has invested in automated testing, I presume to backfill automated testing that wasn't already in place. And the question is, at the end of this initiative to get automated testing in place, how do we know that they're going to be confident enough that that is sufficient, that they could then go and say, you know what, we're making this change, and I don't need to do a bunch of manual testing because I know the automation team did their job and everything's covered.
Man, I'm going to make a comment. I don't think automated testing is going to solve all the world's problems. In fact, I was just at John Bach gave a talk at Portland, where I live, for the PNSQC conference, and he and his brother have written about the checking versus testing and making the distinction. All that automation does is do checks that it meets your expectation. Testing is, in their view, doing explorations, so they really are fans of exploratory testing, that finds where your system really breaks. Having come from a testing role, I've seen a lot of teams say, well, if we just automate things, it'll be really great. And I believe in some automation being good, but you have to really understand what changes, what are the rates of change, and what are the consequences of running all these checks. And if you're really good at automation, maybe they don't take very long, but sometimes they can become so dependent on the code that it makes it really hard to change the code because the 10,000 tests break and maybe you're checking the wrong things. So I've seen a lot of that really very dysfunctional stuff. So in some sense, you have to understand the checking that is necessary to eliminate the risks that you want to have and regress. A lot of teams come to different conclusions about how much of this to do and when. I definitely believe in checking, but I also believe in this testing and poking at it. It is important too. And so, yeah,
Absolutely fair comment. I'm going to change my word to checks then.
okay.
Yeah.
To ensure all of the checks are checked.
Okay, so how do you know that you're really right with doing enough of that? You have, well, okay, so are you changing the software after you do those checks or not? So if you're running the checks over and over again and they're not finding anything, one might ask, are they valuable anymore? And that's a very serious question. I'm trying to be a little contrarian about this. Do I know that I've found everything with enough checks? I never know that because we don't have the ability to do that. We get to a level of confidence and we use checks to keep us in a safety net when we rework and make changes, right? And that's their value.
And I think Linda's about to bust with a comment.
This is an old question, so an old person.
Yeah. And I'm an old person too, Linda, not as old as you. Okay. All right. I started out as a tester.
It's been around forever. You know, how can we ensure, or it used to be prove, because you are
Yes.
into automatic formalization kinds of things. And finally, there was a guy named Dykstra. You probably never heard of him because you don't know your own history. And he said, testing, I don't care how much testing, can never prove anything good about your software. All it can ever do is show that you got some problems. That's it. Amen.
I think you also said testing can't prove the absence of bugs.
That's right.
Yeah.
Nope. Cannot. You never have any proof that you have exactly what you want or proof of goodness. It does not exist. All you can ever show is proof of problems, bugs, whatever you want to call them. That's all. That's it. I don't care, automated or not, doesn't matter.
Dykstra, great theorist. But
No, it's true.
what, from a practical
That's not
perspective, what do
theory.
we do?
But dead.
Was a great theorist.
See where it got
From a
him.
practical perspective, what do we do? You know, should this business have invested in 8 teams? Should they have invested in 5 teams? Getting the level of confidence.
So obviously, if they're investing that level, they've probably had problems, okay? This is my guess.
Yep.
And there's probably reasons why they're investing at that level. My husband used to work at Microsoft, and at that time they were having, you know, the ratio of testers to developers was pretty much at parity. And one would say that's crazy, and it was a combination of crazy but also inefficient, and then they had to test on so many combinatorical different versions of things that it was really a hard problem. So I don't say that testing or checking is bad, but it has to do with your risk and what happens when you have problems in the field, and does that hurt your market or whatever. You know? I mean, and when you do this automation, you want to make sure that your tests are not brittle. I really have seen people test at the wrong level, and they at too much concrete stuff. You want to test on observable behavior, I think, rather than little details in the format of this error message that look at this character. But I've seen people do it at the level, and they think they're being more precise with what they're testing. And what they're doing is that they're really holding down the ability to make any sort of change in the software, you know, without breaking a lot of tests. And that is very dysfunctional. People say, I need more tests, so I'm going to be better if I have the more tests I have, and I kind of bristle at that too. So it has usually, and I'm a fan of test-driven development, but I'm not at this ridiculous level of test. And if you are not changing things, and the checks are always saying, oh, we have no problems, I might say, well, do you have to do all those checks if they are slowing down your process? Maybe not. Okay? And it just depends on your risk and what's been happening to your software.
There's another thing that gets lost with test automation, and this is one of those things where other industries are leaps and bounds ahead of us, right, in terms of their maturity. There's a industrial psychologist at University College named Lisanne Bainbridge, who wrote a paper in '83 called "The Ironies of Automation," where she shows that when testers, for a generic term, rely on more and more automation, they lose the intimacy with the work that they're doing, and they become less and less capable of functioning in their job. They essentially become machine operators. But they don't know what, the machine is manufacturing software. They know how to run the machine, but they don't know anything about the software. You lose your intimacy with the software. I've seen, back in the TDD days, in the early days of XP, being on teams where we were doing this thing, trying to level up by adding more and more and more tests. And I remember watching my teammates, saying the words of the incantations of TDD, tests our documentation, tests help us understand our system, and seeing people who fundamentally didn't understand the system because they didn't interact with it anymore. They didn't interact with it with their hands and with their eyes. So every now and then, it's important to take the automation away, and if you can, load up some of those control surfaces into some other interactive environment, like a command line, and interact exploratorily, peeking and poking and trying to learn and trying to stay intimate with your systems. I tend to write tests now I try to figure out where the edge is, so I'll go without automation until it no longer makes sense to be without automation. And then I'll try to backfill a little bit and try to figure out where that point of discomfort is, rather than what I did when I started trying to understand extreme programming, which was, I remember we had a leaderboard in our office with like X thousand unit tests, X thousand functional integration tests, whatever the hell those words mean. They don't really mean anything. And then X lines of code of fit and fitness tests, which also require tests to be written on those tests because they were drivers. And I remember, I still think, wow, that is just such an absolutely disastrous and destructive and harmful thing to be doing, sort of in judging ourselves on how many lines of code, test code we could write. Because there's this other insidious quality of tests. Every test you write increases the amount of coupling in your system. And coupling makes you go slower. So you want to write tests so you can go faster, but you're using a mechanism that inherently will make you go slower. You come to the realization that you've got to find that fine knife edge where to write the right amount of tests, not the most amount of tests. But the Lisanne Bainbridge paper is really interesting because it'll show you what the other industries already know, and that is we need to remain intimate. And I think that's what Brett and James Bach and Ken Kater are talking about with exploratory testing. Testing is about staying connected and intimate and knowledgeable about your system, not being a button pusher or a monkey or a machinist.
I think we've identified the theme for this coming spring's Q&A conference. Any further comments on this rather beginning to wish you hadn't asked the question? Bring the microphone to you.
So my question is, a situation where you have multiple Agile projects going on in an organization, and some of the projects follow different ways of doing it. For example, you have a project going on which is based on 2 weeks Scrum, and maybe other projects 4 weeks in one sprint, or 2 weeks one sprint. And maybe estimations are different. Some of them use story points, some of them use hours. So it's the same organization, but different ways of doing the project. But is that quality is acceptable? And if it is not, what would you suggest from a governance point of view? What controls you need to establish to have a good practice in place?
Is it working for you?
It works, yes and no.
What's the no part?
Yeah, what's the no part?
The no part is that there is no standardization as an organization point of view. The communication between different teams becomes difficult.
More,
Yes.
okay.
So that's the challenge. And also maybe from the customer point of view, they might see that the same organization works different ways. And this also questions how you guys are coordinating.
Standardization is not a goal in itself. You have to really balance it. It may be an attitude from management that says, oh, I want to see only one head, or I want to see only one process. Standardization is not the goal in itself.
Standard Agile, that's an interesting question. What would that be? I don't think there is one.
If each of those teams came to those on their own, they're modifying and adapting the process to what works for them. You don't want to be screwing with it for the sake of consistency and standards.
One thing about, I don't understand this about, I don't care about story points or hours or whatever.
No, just an example. I was just
Yeah.
giving something.
Any of that stuff, throw it away. I don't care. I never look at it. It's useless. Your story points are only for one and one thing, for the team to understand the bigness of what they're taking on, so they can commit to it, but they can do it 2 or 4 weeks. Doesn't matter. If you're really worried about the communication across these, or you're doing a scrum of scrums. If you don't have one of those, then that's probably a real problem. Whatever you do, put somebody that's an experienced scrum master at the end of that, not a manager.
So one of the things that I also heard you say is maybe there's different cadences of delivery, if they have different time frames for that. And actually, that can be an interesting or challenging thing for people to address. I know some teams have done things where they do need to commit features to the outside, and there's different cadences of delivery. Actually, at Mozilla, where my husband works, they kind of figured this out, and they're now doing very frequent releases, but they have this model of fitting things into a boxcar, and when we have a release date, what is done and delivered. And not everything, if you have these different cadences, always work, and sure, there's dependencies sometimes between various changes or whatever, but they really worried about their process of building in order to accommodate that, and then they were able to deal with that. But there may be different cadences that are natural for teams to do. So I don't always believe, yeah, our scrum has to be 1 week or 2 weeks or whatever. Now, maybe there's historical reasons, or maybe they're just gratuitous reasons for differences. But yeah, there are ways to deal with that.
I always find it offensive when I'm sitting in a room, like a good Agile workspace where it's open, and everybody's not breathing at the same, and their hearts are not beating the same. It's just noise. I really wish they'd just get the same breathing and the same heartbeat. Otherwise, it's really hard to concentrate. But when you take it to this, if you take the standardization thing to the ultimate outcome,
Breathe
you're going to
in.
find there's more and more.
Breathe in, breathe out.
Yeah,
Okay, okay.
there's more and more. There are more and more rhythms, cadences, as Rebecca was calling them. There are more and more things that happen on rhythms, and even within a team that's got a standardization, there's other things that are happening on other rhythms. What's really important, I think Philippe was saying is, you have moments where different work streams have to synchronize around some common operation. That's what's important. And that's what the team managers, leaders, whatever, coordinators, what those coordinators are supposed to do. they're not supposed to be trying to figure out how to take the variations out of the cadences. They're supposed to be there to figure out how to make the synchronization between those variations happen easily. So their job is not to make their job easy. Their job is to make the interaction or the coordination easy. And if they can't do that, the worst damn thing they could do is try to say, well, let's figure out how we can get all the variations stamped out of this thing. You'll never end. There'll be a never-ending tirade of variation. You're going to solve one layer and be like, oh, look, all these other things don't happen at the same time. And basically, it's going to be like, you know, it's going to be like taking your teams and just shaking the hell out of them with oscillation all the time. It's going to be more, it's going to be very, very distracting, and it'll waste. I don't know if it'll be a waste, but it'll take a lot of time.
Any additional comments?
Never shake the baby.
All right. You next.
Yeah. So I'm curious about this part of the work because from the other part of the work. So what are your thoughts about what is the next step for Agile and the community of Agile practitioners? What is the next step? What should we be reaching?
To be displaced with the next generation of methodologies. I hope.
It's probably the wrong person to ask that question. Go for it, Scott.
I hope, I actually think this is true, to a certain extent. I mean, you know, Martin Fowler wrote the new methodology like 15 years ago. That was the dawn for a lot of people coming into this. I mean, think of it, 15 years of Agile, that's longer than, I mean...
No, it's waterfall's still going on.
No,
I don't think we replace anything.
How long did Microsoft Solutions Framework last? How long did, well, I mean, I know it's, you know, something that's, because something is older doesn't mean it's no longer good, but I'm just saying, I mean, think about it, it's 15 years. Does it even matter? I mean, should we be looking beyond? I know I'm changing your question. I'm making my point about your point, which is how we do it on this side.
We're not politicians.
My question is about the next step, right? So we are supposed to constantly evolve, improve,
Right.
grow.
What I was
Agile is not a place.
But
it's
if
a
we
way,
evolve, is it acceptable to evolve beyond Agile? Or can we only evolve within Agile? And if that's true, doesn't that seem like we're limiting the extent of our ability to transcend? We've already demonstrated that we can transcend because we got to Agile to begin with. So where's the movement beyond?
Postmodern Agile, okay. So I actually think that...
Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, well, I actually think that there are lots of next steps going on. And one of the things that I remember from an experience report, so this is another plug for experience reports, someone said if I'm doing XP the same way a year from now that I did last year, I haven't learned anything. I'm not doing XP. So the spirit of Agile is doing and learning and adapting. And if that becomes at some point when we say this is a new species, or not, that's kind of a hard thing. You know, scientists have trouble. When do finches evolve into different subspecies or whatever? On the other hand, I do believe that there will be disruptive ways, you know, the new shiny ideas that will come in from who knows where. I do think that one of the things that we, you know, the next step of Agile is to actually reintroduce some of the other thinking that we might have discarded along the way, because Agile said, oh yeah, you know, evolutionary design is great. Well, what happens when we need to really do some design thinking? That's one of my hot buttons. Or how do we do our architecture work, which is Poliano talked about, whatever these little side teams were. We're trying to find ways of sneaking back in. I hate to say that. Things that we said, oh, in our exuberance to be like puppies doing Agile, that might have been good practices. So I think that recognition of some of those activities is a next step, and I see that happening with a lot of different groups doing different things, different experiments that are working for them.
Okay, it's already been happening. In fact, it's been happening all along. I started doing some Agile projects in the mid-90s, and I wrote an article for IEEE software, and after it was published, I got email from a guy who said, oh, I read your report in software about Agile, but I just had a couple of questions for you. One of them was, well, did you have an architecture? I said, well, of course we had an architecture. He said, well, that's not in there. I said, I went to that website, that's all we had at the time. It was Ken Schwaber's www.controlchaos.com, which is still out there. And he said, there's nothing there about architecture. I said, oh my gosh. He said, probably nothing there about eating 3 meals a day, going to the bathroom occasionally, getting a certain amount of sleep. Gosh, we better put all that in. And that's what we've been doing. Putting stuff back in, just like Rebecca said, but not always the old wisdom, also new stuff. When Mary Poppendieck came along, everybody started throwing rotten tomatoes at her. And then just all of a sudden overnight, it was like, oh, well, we've always been lean. So let's just throw that in there as well. So it's already happening. Just look at the, I don't know, progress might not be the right word, but look at the changes that have already been happening. It's not what it was in the mid-90s.
When I first started hanging out with Agilistas, as we call them, leadership was a dirty word. Self-organizing teams, self-managing teams, we don't need leaders. Absolutely. Took me a long time. I just kept hanging around, knocking on the door, and finally they went, oh yeah, maybe they'll be useful. Maybe they can provide some value somehow. So the whole concept of Agile leadership, which to me centers around the Agile mindset and the Agile culture, and helping create that. And the one thing that's been fascinating to me is Agile to me doesn't mean software anymore. Agile means everywhere. And I help everybody, nonprofits, for-profits, architects firms, anybody, manufacturing firms. It's fascinating to me. So it took a long time for us to get there, and I still don't think everybody believes me. Ryan Merrick probably would say, you're useless, Pollyanna, get out of here.
Oh, sure. Well, so yeah, nobody's going to agree on this kind of stuff because, and I know that I have my strengths that I saw kind of lessened in the beginning of Agile. You know, where does design thinking happen, or where does usability happen? And various people have been pushing on that, like Jeff Patton, for example, with the usability, figuring out how all these things fit in, and then how we can excel at what we're doing and make the software we produce, if we're doing software, habitable for the people who have to build it so that they can keep doing it. You know, we're going to be constantly doing new things. And, you know, it's pretty exciting times, I think. But it's not that at some point I believe that some folks think that Agile is going to be so watered down it's meaningless, and I've heard that. And I think, you know, that's because there are some people who like to stir up and start things, and then they move on to the next, whatever it is, to be disruptive they like. And you know, the rest of us just do what we do and try to fit in. So
when I start talking to people about Agile, and you have to deal with the uncertainty, and leaders are horrible with this. They say to them, you have a 5% chance of getting it right from the beginning. That's a NASA number. When they start building things, they have a 5% chance of getting it right. So if you were going to ask me what's going to happen a year from now, I'm probably tell you something, and I have a 95% chance I'm lying.
or 98%, I think I would have. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't tell you. What I can say is, if we follow the basic principles of continuous learning, and we're willing to admit that some of the first ideas and principles we tried out don't quite work anymore, well, who knows where it's going to go? I think we're on to something. We'll see where it happens. I'm just gonna enjoy the ride. Because every year it's different.
Hold on, we have, Eugene, you had your hand up before.
Yes, my question stems from Scott's answer to the previous question. How do we reconcile between teams' natural desire to improve with the hard reality that blows in their face every day?
That what?
The reality. Problems in production, old bugs that happened God knows how many years ago, unforeseen immediate requests from the business, etc., etc. You name it, the reality.
It used to be that when I started working in companies, that the teams finally said to me, you know, the manager's coming down and blowing up the sprint, telling us we got to stop, we got to do something. So I went around to the teams and I said, what's the price tag there? And they said 70% of what we've done is lost. So it comes back to talking to these people in a language they can understand. So you're going to lose 70% by blowing up the sprint. The other one about all the realities that hit people is I say, remember that, and when you're talking about how much capacity you have, take into account a reality. So now what you're talking about, your 60-40 rule, probably is down to something like 22 months. Because that's all that, you have all this other legacy and problems coming from the outside in that are hitting you all the time that you have to take care of. But I ask the teams how they want to handle it. Sometimes, I don't know, they figure it out, but they allocate it. Is that what you wanted to know? Something like that? The reality of life? Maybe.
Yeah, my question's also related to the previous question, the question of what's the next big thing. And actually, I guess it's not a question, but a counterpoint or a couple counterpoints. One is that I think you on the panel have been doing Agile for the last 15, if not 20 years. But if we polled the audience, I don't think any of us have been doing it for 15 years. In fact, here in Vancouver, it's been rather slow at adopting, and I would say that there's a lot of us in the room that, I'm not speaking for myself, just in general, that maybe haven't only started doing Agile in the last 5, 4, 3, couple of years. That's the one point, and then there's the other related point that the people that are doing Agile, and perhaps have only done it for a couple of years, they think they've got it down pat and they've figured it all out and they're Agile. So there's no reason for them to improve to become more Agile. And my point, I guess, is that when you think you've figured it all out, you're only just beginning. That there's so much more to improve on when you think you know it all.
When you think you know it all, you're probably at the end. Really. You know,
The end of what? You're learning?
Yeah, you're not going. You know, that's why I mean, I'm sort of half tongue-in-cheek and half serious. Like, I wish that everything didn't have to be agile, 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 because at some point it becomes over time something will become a strict definition. The real challenge that you would have getting into it in the last few years is that let's call them latecomers to something, really have to struggle with keeping up with the Joneses, and a lot of what happens in that later wave is simply trying to be compliant with what they see as what everybody else is doing, which creates an even more rigid and even more orthodox, mindless way of doing things, and that increases the rate of concretion around these ideas, which inevitably ends up in them being so rigid that they're rejected. So I still kind of wonder, like, why does it matter? You know, I mean, there's so many great techniques, and if you know the techniques, then you don't necessarily have to call it agile. Just learn the techniques, learn them in context, learn them how they combine with each other, study, 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 practice, 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 or else you risk getting caught in these orthodoxies, these eddies of orthodoxy that really just get stuck. And I was telling Rebecca about a project I was on in 2007 where we had real problems that were outside of the Agile orthodoxy at that time, and we needed to do other things. But the team wouldn't do other things because they were things outside of what was strict Agile. And we catastrophically failed, where we could have chosen to do things that were simply a little bit outside of the bounds, but it was socially unacceptable to do that. That's what happens with rigidity. As to what's coming next, I'm writing a new methodology. I would like very much for it to become the world's dominant form of software development. So I would like you all to use mine. The trademark issues we can figure out later, but we can talk about that next year.
I'll give another answer to the what's next. I don't think that we will see something with a name like Schmoldu who's going to replace Agile. I think many of the good stuff of Agile will just become part of the normal fabric on how our industry does work. Let me use an analogy using my old age. In the 70s, the big issue was languages and compilers. And the other side of the table, operating systems. That was the debate. And then 10 years later, it was the object-oriented wars. You probably remember that. Okay. But all the things have become an integral part of the thing. You still use languages and compilers. It's just not the major issue that you have to deal with. So some of the Agile philosophy and practices, they'll become part of the natural fabric. We'll add another layer of sophistication. We'll have other practices to address some other issues that are surfacing. And I was hinting in the presentation next door as to what I see as two big issues ahead of us in the software IT industry. We need to start reusing stuff. Developing a lot of new software creates an enormous maintenance problem that is eating more than 50% of our workforce and therefore exceeds the workforce that we can produce. Now we've been protected from that in the last 12 years by outsourcing some of that to other countries, India and so on, Brazil. But this now has reached its limits. So we have to start, using software that is more or less ready-made in the form of components that we can configure and stop writing a lot of things. When we will stop writing a lot of things, then pair programming will disappear and compiler will vanish away, and we'll look at more how do we design and assemble and combine stuff. So new practices will emerge. Other issues are, we have been outpaced by hardware. We are now facing, massive multi-core systems that we don't know how to exploit with legacy code. Because we have been all trained in a mentality where we see sequential thread. We think about programmers, things that execute sequentially.
We need to become map reducers.
And maybe we sometimes say, oh, we have two threads that do something and they need to communicate. But thinking massively parallel, it's a pretty difficult thing. And we'll have to rediscover some of the techniques that were invented in the 70s and 80s, including by people like Dijkstra, by the way. When you deal with parallelism, massively parallel system, you have to start thinking about L2, L1 caches, size of your data structure. We've been forgetting about that. Now, my data structure is 1 megabyte a piece, so what? Add another terabyte on my machine. Well, when you want to have massive parallelism, some of the things that were core of what we were doing in the 70s and 80s become pretty important. So Agile will just think in the pond, be part of the structure. Some of the practices will have them sort of spontaneously, implicitly applied. New practices will be added to sort out other problems that are beyond the problems that we were trying to sort out in 2000.
It's funny, it's almost like the conversation around components stopped, had a lot of getting more momentum with RUP, with UML around 1997 to 2000.
Right, 2000.
And then along came Agile, and the component conversation pretty much evaporated.
Yep.
Another thing that evaporated is traceability.
Oh, yeah.
And this is pretty important if we want to do high quality software, tracing all dependencies between things, including test requirements and like that. And this was sort of brushed away suddenly around 2003. And now some people say, oh, wow, maybe we need some tooling to be able to manage all the things. Yes, those existed in the 90s. No, not necessarily that, but
Well, I mean, they existed,
Yeah,
but
they
unfortunately, they were on the right-hand side of the column for the manifesto,
Yeah.
so they're
They're out. So yeah, that's the thing I really am saddened about. It's like this over that means people who are doing the not the knee-jerk reaction. They will forget whatever that people in interactions over something over there, and they'll forget what it was. I view a lot of my job has been to raise awareness of these other things, and at the same time, also getting people to not feel guilty when they're trying experiments. And I think we're getting a lot better at that, so I'm encouraged. But I remember in early days of experience reports, I shepherded a lot of these experience reports, and people would feel guilty when they said, "Oh, we're doing code inspections." You know, we're not just doing our tests, we're having code inspections too. Well, you know, people have done studies that find how many percent of the bugs do you find by doing this, this, and this, and you know, adding up, nothing finds all of the bugs. So anything you can do to improve the quality is a good thing to the level that you're worried about the quality. So people in the early times used to feel guilty when they were substituting or replacing practices, and I said, well, no, there was a reason why you did that, right? You decided to have a code review whenever you were checking something in that would affect threading, because the last time you had someone just make a test, a simple thing, and checked it in and it brought down your whole site, wasn't that a bad thing? So now we have some of these checks in place that are like code inspections. And you said, yeah. So, but they used to feel guilty about that. Remember all these experience reports. Am I really doing Agile if I'm doing? No. Don't ask, are you really doing Agile? What the heck is that? Yeah.
All right, I'm going to pick one more question because we haven't heard from you, and then we're wrap it up. Put you on the spot.
Sure.
That's all right.
It's a comment around, a couple of people have mentioned about doing continuous improvement on their teams as they get closer and closer to Agile utopia. What do they start looking for in terms of improvement? And wanted to see if you guys agree with my thoughts, which are that there is no such thing, because it's all in the context of the given team. If one team has been doing Agile for a couple of years and they've put in various processes, they hopefully don't put in various problems intentionally, put in various processes to meet their business needs, to solve problems that exist within their team. After maybe a couple of years and they've matured their own team, the continuous improvement for them would be the removal of some of those processes as opposed to the addition. And I think sometimes the context of this conversation is often like, well, what else are we going to add to make things better?
That's an interesting observation. You said we can remove things, because I'm right now shepherding another experience report from a gentleman from Romania who's talking about a 5-year journey that they've had in their team, getting, introducing Agile without really giving a name to these, but doing practices. And one of the things that they discovered is that they could remove things after a while, like a certain column in their Kanban and these things, because they knew and they worked efficiently as a team and it was the same team. But then when they added new team members in, and what they had is visible process things or things that we do weren't part of those newcomers coming in. They kind of weren't as effective. So it's interesting that when your team evolves and you add new people, sometimes what becomes ingrained and you do remove, you may have to add back in or explain why you're doing things. So a culture of a team changes over time. That's just my one thought about that. But yes, indeed.
Maybe we need standardization.
Yeah, right.
The same Kanban for everybody.
So you can
The great
remove.
thing about that is you can do certifications.
Right, right. So you can remove things, and sometimes you need to add back things in. And there's several things that they've discovered. It's like they used to do a board, but then they got more efficient, so the things became too many on the board to really manage, and they put it into a tool, but then nobody looked at the tool, so they regressed. And then they said, well, how can we solve that? And then they said, well, people are lazy, let's just buy a monitor so we can show things in the tool in our workroom. And because there is more efficiency that way. So they're constantly adapting, and that requires reflection and commitment to something, and then, am I going to learn and change? And yes, they drop and add and bring things back in, and I find it fascinating because that's just tuning your team. And I don't think the goal is to go always faster and faster and faster and faster. In fact, that's one of the things I hate about the word sprint. I'm a long distance runner, right? I run half marathons or marathons. And I think pacing and cadence is really important to that. You don't start out sprinting. And in fact, if I were to change one thing, I would change that word sprint.
I'm a sprinter, and at the finish line, like, I'm not going to do anything else for the day. So.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that software development is about doing it for the long haul, not just for 2 weeks. So,
what would be great with these the continuous improvement is if that continuous improvement embraced the science of continuous improvement and didn't simply treat it as a soft skill. There's a soft Kaizen and a hard Kaizen, and the harder Kaizen involves some effort to observe what you changed and see and follow up on what the outcomes are,
yeah.
and try to figure out if you can make some objective ways of maybe quantifying, but maybe just objectively qualifying some things, like surface data points. Maybe not hard data points, maybe loosey-goosey, but that would be great, because if you're going to change something, if we're going to do continuous improvement, you say continuous improvement, I hear Kaizen. If you're going to do Kaizen, there's a requirement for saying what you're going to do, what you're going to change, what you expect is going to happen, and then following up and seeing if that does happen. And then really embracing with that is a kind of the fun of science. Not the onerousness of spreadsheets and, but there's a fun in science. Figure it out if it worked. Somebody said experimentation earlier. That's, yeah.
That's in 1976.
Say again? What is it?
Goal, question, metrics. What is the goal? What is the question that you have to answer to know that you've achieved the goal? And then put in place the metrics in order to answer the question so that you know how close you are from the goal.
I'm sorry, I don't know whether we're going to have a pissing contest about books, but one that Mary and Tom Poppendiek recommended to me that I thought was really fantastic about trying to figure this out was called Managing to Learn, which is a neat book about a manager and a worker working, kind of the manager coaching the worker on how to construct an experiment. And it follows the dialogues. One page is the dialogue from the manager, the other page is the dialogue from the worker, and it really just goes through a problem-solving thing through a continuous improvement exercise that required a little bit more rigor. Not a whole lot of rigor, but just a little bit more rigor, and the book provides example worksheets and stuff like that. And I think that would be really helpful. But it's nowhere near, it's not going to be on the Agile bookshelf. So that would be another thing where I would say, look out, spread out a little bit. This world of industry has a lot of things that we can learn from.
I think that's a very good comment to wrap it up on.
I would rather Pollyanna wrap it up because I feel intimidated.
Phil, is that what you remind me? I'm on it. In the
All right.
bar. I've got
1
it.
minute. Wrap it up.
Wrap it up? Oh.
It's all yours, lady.
Panel dismissed.
For me, one of the greatest things Agile has done for us is this thing of learn and adapt. As long as we give people the ownership to learn and adapt, believe me, they'll figure it out. I've had managers tell me, You can't let teams make those kind of decisions. I said, really? I've never seen a problem with them. As long as we are learning and adapting, that's the greatest gift, in my opinion, Agile has given us. Learning and adapting, not just rigid, follow this.
Amen to that. Rebecca, 1 minute?
Oh, 1 minute, no, I pass.
Or less.
Less. I'm not a sprinter, yeah. So, one of the things that I feel strongly about is that when Agile becomes only a buzzword, then it will become meaningless. And I haven't raised this little fear about that, but I actually kind of agree with Scott in that I don't really care what you call it, as long as you are learning and adapting. But don't get caught into the trap of continuous improvement means I always have to sweat and really work hard or whatever, because you can't do that all the time. Sometimes you're in the groove, just go. You know, if you're talking about, well, 2 years we're doing Agile, it's okay. Well, if it's working for you, well, okay. Now in 3 months, have a retrospective and see, well, how was it going for us? You know, so don't always say continuous improvement means that I have to sweat at it all the time, because that's just, you know, oh, I haven't changed. Oh, am I doing okay? That's dysfunctional to start worrying about that. So that's chill.
Chuck, any final comments?
I think it comes back to the learning, and it's really learning without the Agile blinders on. That there is so much that's out there, but architecture at one time was kind of thrown out the window. And Philippe's talk today talked about bringing that back in. That there's so many things that we've highlighted today that I think early on in Agile we did kind of throw out initially that are actually really valuable, and that's the learning is bringing them back in.
Linda?
I'm going to piggyback on what Scott said, because I just wrote another article for IEEE software called Science and Stories. And that often I begin a presentation by asking people in the room, well, how many of you doing Agile? They raise their hand. And I say, did you look at all the randomized controlled experiments that showed clearly that Agile is much better than whatever it was that you were doing before? And nobody raises a hand. And I say, well, that's, at least you're honest, because there aren't any. We don't do science when we make decisions in this industry, and we never have. We don't even do little experiments and collect a whole lot of data or of any kind. We go on stories, and I heard that that company over there, they're doing Agile, and wow, it really worked for them. And my analogy is with the drug industry. How many of you use drugs? Are you buying them on the street?
Industrial scale.
If you're buying them on the street corner, then that's kind of how we operate. Is some guys standing on the street corner and say, "Hey, these are really good. These little blue pills. You might like them." And then you try them and say, "Yeah, boy, they really work for me."
Last night, I listened to a very long presentation from the Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield, just 2 blocks far from here. And he said quite a few impressive things. He's a pretty impressive guy. He was the commander for one of the last 2013 mission on the International Space Station. He said something that is relevant to us. He said, you know, something about leadership and management, whether it's leader or project manager, doesn't really matter. You have to delegate decisions. You delegate the decisions to the right people lower, but you really have to delegate them. And you cannot just say, I delegate the decision, but when you come up with a decision, I will tell you I don't like it. And in order to do that, you have to develop a certain level of trust, but also train the people, give them all the information and the data so that they can make a decision that you don't have even to look a second time at. And I was reflecting to that on the bus coming back home, and I realized that a lot of people who are caught in this project manager versus scrum master versus leader, they haven't completely relinquished the thing, I'm the old guy on the team. Yes, I'm happy that you get self-organized and you make decisions, but in the end, I have the right to override you. So that's something that I've learned last night about leadership and management. And he gave some concrete example. They had a crisis with this leak of ammonia that they had in the thing, and they had to make some pretty quick decision, including getting out of the space station to fix things and stop the leak and things like that. And he says, these are circumstances where you cannot have a command and control. I cannot tell every one of the 5 other guys what they have to do. I have to trust that they've all got the right training, all the information that I have, and I just coordinate and dispatch people, and everybody makes a decision and moves on. So just little stuff that I've learned.
Scott, you get the last word. Or have you had enough?
Hello, my name is Scott. I am an anger addict, and since I got to Vancouver, I haven't been very angry for 24 hours. And I want to thank you for a day without too much anger. It's been very nice.
And on that note, would everybody please join me?